Thank you for joining us in this conversation on the history of forced child-family separation in Indigenous communities and the role of the Catholic Church in that history and its impact to this day. Before we begin, let's make sure that everybody can access interpretation if they need it. We have a global audience. There's a globe icon at the bottom of your screen, and you may choose to listen to this conversation in English, French, or Spanish. And if you prefer to hear the interpreters only without the speaker's voice in the background, please select mute original audio. My name is Gillian Hubner, and I lead the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University. We're located on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples, who have served as stewards of this region for generations. This conversation is jointly convened with Catholic Relief Services and the Changing the Way We Care initiative in Georgetown's Indigenous Studies Working Group. We're grateful to be joined by such a thoughtful panel today. Welcome Jim LaBelle, Samuel Torres, Father Bisson, and Stephanie Jacoby. You are all doing such extraordinarily compelling work to help us move towards truth and hopefully justice. I'm thankful for this opportunity to learn from you. As background, this is the fourth webinars in a series. It's part of the Faith in the Family Forum, which considers the role of the Catholic Church in child-family separation in a variety of historical and regional contexts. We've so far looked at the theology of the child in children's care and protection. We've looked at child-family separation in the history of American slavery. Today, we're looking at Indigenous boarding schools. We've also looked at the development and use of residential care or orphanages worldwide. The forum will also be looking at the Church's role in preventing child-family separation and supporting vulnerable children, families, and communities in other contexts, including in migration policy and response. For the topic of today, to ground in history, for centuries, Indigenous children were removed from their families and sent to boarding schools or placed in adoptive non-Indigenous families. Hundreds of thousands of American Indian, Alaska Native, Canadian First Nations, Native Hawaiian, and Aboriginal children in Australia were forced to attend boarding schools, where many experienced hunger, violence, forced labor, and sometimes sexual abuse. Indigenous parents and children who resisted child-family separation were often harshly punished. The goal of forcible removals was to assimilate Indigenous children into Western society, erasing Indigenous identity, language, cultures, and religious practices. This was a legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery and a series of papal bulls that had been used since the 15th century to justify colonization by European powers and missionaries. Forced child-family separation was endorsed by the governments of Australia, Canada, and the United States, and involved Catholic and Protestant churches. This history is painful, and it lives on our soil and in our bodies and in our institutions, and it requires reckoning. I'd like to start the conversation by grounding it in living history. We're joined by Jim LaBelle, who was separated from his family at a young age and sent to the Wrangell Institute from 1955 to 1965. Jim, you've had a long and impactful career since then, including serving in the U.S. Navy, and you're now on the board, or you're the board president of the National Native American Boarding Schools Healing Coalition. Can you share with us some of your experience and how being removed from your family and your home and forced to attend boarding school, how this shaped you, and how this personal experience informs your current efforts to address the harm and seek truth, justice, and healing? Thank you, Jim. Jim, you're muted. Can you unmute your, yeah, sorry, thank you.
What I said, no, I'm just kidding. I'm really honored to be here and to have been invited and to participate on this panel with with you all, and I just wanted to remind all of us that I suppose the eyes of the world are looking at us and our country and our churches to see how they are going to interact with the stories that we're going to share and how we can go forward from that. I think in some ways it really began with South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation of Nelson Mandela and Reverend Tutu, and that served as a wonderful model for Canada, I believe, that went through their own truth and healing or truth and reconciliation. And other countries as well are doing this. And now I think the world is looking at how we are going to address this in some way. And I just wanted to say that if you think about the Catholic Pope, Pope Francis coming to North America and making his apology, I think that's a wonderful gesture, and I'm sure he meant it with all sincerity. And I suppose he's expecting some sort of follow-up to how do we, because I think everyone knows that an apology is one thing, but to take action based on that apology is something else. And I'm hoping it goes beyond the apology in terms of how do we restore some of the things that we got lost as a result of assimilation and forced acculturation. I'm a great example of that. When I was a child, I believed I was bilingual. I could speak both my Inupiaq language and English, of course. My dad was French and Irish from Wisconsin, and I had to shut down my Inupiaq side in boarding school because I saw so many of my fellow students being severely punished for speaking their own language. And and I think if you are mindful of language, it really represents our identity. And when we get stripped from speaking our language, like in boarding school or boarding home programs or adoption programs, it begins, with our losing who we are as an individual, as a person. And I'll leave it with there for now and add to it later. Thank you.
Jim, can you give us a little background? How old were you when you were forcibly separated? And I believe your mother was given a choice, right? For adoption, or can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, my mother became a widow when our father passed away, and the social workers of Fairbanks at the day in that time saw or believed that they saw that she was not taking care of us very well from their Western idea of what a family should be like, and so told her, she had to make a choice: give up your two boys for adoption or send them to boarding school. And I was 8 years old at the time, and my brother was 6. But in my 10 years, I went to 2 boarding schools during that 10-year period. 6 years at a place called Wrangell Institute, which had grades from 1 to 8, and I saw children as young as 5 years old that journeyed with us hundreds and hundreds of miles away to kind of an alien landscape in Southeast Alaska, away from our tundra villages and really loving families, and got put into this very strict military style boarding school. I was basically modeled by the first one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, called the Carlisle Industrial School. And Wrangell Institute was no different. It was very much a military style barracks. We had to march to classes, march to the mess hall. Everything was done with some sort of order. And there was really devoid of any love or affection, or and we were pretty stoic during the day, but when the lights went off and we were in this darkened place with our own thoughts, and it didn't take very long for one or two to begin crying for their mothers, and it began, and it was added to, and pretty soon the entire dorm, especially the little boys' dorm, would be just kind of wailing into the night for their mothers. It was if you can imagine maybe 100 little boys crying like that in the dark of their rooms, until we cried ourselves to sleep.
That's powerful, that imagery. Thank you for bringing us into that space, that reality. So we're going to move from Alaska to what is now Canada, where from the 1880s to the 1990s, the Canadian government ran a system of compulsory boarding schools for Indigenous children. About 150,000 children were separated from their families and sent to these residential schools, 70% of which were operated by the Catholic Church. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was officially launched in 2008 as part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. And in July 2022, as Jim just mentioned, Pope Francis undertook a penitential pilgrimage to Canada, where he apologized for the Roman Catholic Church's involvement in the residential schools and the abuse of Indigenous children for over 100 years. Father Peter Bisson is with us from Canada. He's a Jesuit priest, serving as the assistant to the Jesuit Provincial for Justice, Ecology, and Indigenous Relations in Canada. Peter, you've been directly involved in the TRC process representing the Jesuits, and you've written beautifully about that experience. We'll share a link to his book in the chat box, or the chapter in the chat box. But what has this reckoning been like in Canada? And what have you learned about what truth and healing require specifically of the church? Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jim. I'm honored to be and privileged to be part of this panel. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging my gratitude for living and working on unceded Algonquin territory here in what's otherwise known as Ottawa. And I'd also like to point out that I'll be speaking or sharing experiences as a settler, as a church person, and I'm speaking especially to settlers and church people about what the Jesuits are learning, have learned and are learning in the Truth and Reconciliation process, and basically to encourage other settlers to engage in this, even if it hurts. Well, it will hurt, but not to be afraid of it. So I'd like to share 3 important learnings with you. The first one is about the Truth and Reconciliation process itself and the essential link between truth and reconciliation. So someone once said The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. It's true. But the misery is worthwhile. It is real, but it leads to new life if you don't avoid it. So where does the misery come from? It comes from the truth about ourselves. It comes from the truth of what was done to children, what was done to Indigenous people through colonization. And what's especially scary for settlers, though, the litigation is scary, but what's even scarier, I think, is the change in our collective identity. It's discovering that we're not as nice as we thought we were, and that for church people, even what we thought were our holiest desires to do good, for example, have been corrupted by our involvement in the colonization processes and the links between evangelization and colonization that were there, have been there for the past 500 years. So the truth doesn't stop there either. It includes today the unjust settler privilege and power that we now enjoy. This is part of our truth. It's part of our story. It's part of who we have been and who we are now. It might not be the whole picture, but it is part of the picture, and we've been learning about it from what Indigenous people have been telling us about how they see us. Another key learning about the truth and reconciliation process is that there are no shortcuts to reconciliation. Any attempt to evade or avoid or mitigate the truth and the misery only postpones it. Sooner or later, it's going to come around. Even worse, though, it only postpones the new life on the other side of the misery. Thirdly, for settlers, a focus on apology and Indigenous healing, important as it is, can actually mask our own involvement in the process, mask our own power and privilege without changing the underlying unequal power dynamics of the relationship. So apology must reach down to those relationships and work on transforming us. So we mustn't forget or mask the side of the story that is the decolonization, the transformation of the settler side, the church side of this relationship. And in talking about the truth and reconciliation process, the last thing I'd like to leave you with is with the Pope. The Pope, as he was leaving Canada, actually used the word genocide. He didn't say cultural genocide, he said genocide with no adjectives. So we haven't, at least in the church in Canada, we really haven't begun to digest what that means for us, what that acknowledgement and confession means for us. The second big learning for us is that I'd like to share with you is what's on the other side of the misery. I mean, you don't pass through it in a definitive way. It comes back again and again. But what's on the other side? When we stopped listening in a self-defensive way, we started to recognize things that had been there all along, but that we couldn't see because we were too wrapped up in defending our identity, or the way we understood of our identity. One thing that we didn't note, especially in the truth and reconciliation process, the commissioners never treated us like we were defendants in a legal process. They had every right to, but instead they were treating us as potential partners in a long process of reconciliation. So Indigenous people aren't asking us to leave. They are asking us to respect the treaties. For church people, Indigenous people, whether they're traditional or Christian or whatever their faith is, we can be allies in the things of the Spirit. Indigenous people have never removed the sacred from creation or from life. In Western culture, we've done that, including in the church, to our damage. So we should be allies in promoting things of the Spirit. And then after the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, I think Indigenous people understand better the spiritual power and beauty of creation than we do. So if we're going to pursue integral ecological conversion, as the Pope calls us to, we need to learn from our Indigenous friends and partners. The last thing I'd like to share with you, learning I'd like to share with you, is a bit more specific to the Jesuits in Canada. We've been, in our history, we've been connected with Indigenous people for 400 years, our entire time in the country, for good and for ill. These are long relationships and families that we've known for generations as well. As we look back over this history from a spiritual point of view, we've realized that we are most ourselves, we're most Jesuit when we are in right relations with Indigenous people. So that's our new identity that has come out for us through the Truth and Reconciliation process that I'd like to share with you. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience.
I was muted, sorry. I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, if you don't mind. Thank you for sharing that sort of evolution of consciousness, almost, it sounds like. How, I mean, the Catholic, we can understand the Catholic Church as like the big church and the provincial church and the community church. Has the big church in Canada acted in one way versus the provinces or the different communities within the global church?
Yes, I think so. The mainstream of the Catholic Church took a long time to do a collective apology. It really only happened about a year before the Pope came. And that included the bishops collectively agreeing to invite the Pope. He wasn't going to come without that kind of an invitation. It wasn't enough for the Prime Minister to do it or whatever. So that took a long time. There were exceptions, of course, in various parts of the church, other religious congregations like the Jesuits or various dioceses. But from my point of view, a defensive approach was more common in the mainstream of the church up until the Pope's visit, or to be more precise, up until the discovery of the unmarked graves in Kamloops in British Columbia. So that really shook up the Catholic grassroots and put a lot of pressure on the bishops to do a collective apology and finally to invite the Pope.
Okay, that's helpful to understand the process and the truth pushing the church along.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we're going to now head a bit south on Turtle Island to what is now the United States. Canada and the US share a very similar history with regard to Indigenous child-family separation, but some have said that Canada is at least 20 years ahead of the United States in its reckoning. Our Catholic bishops haven't made a joint statement. We haven't invited the Pope here, for instance, nor do we have legislation that's passed helping us to focus on some of this, as you do in Canada. So in the United States, there were more than 500 government-funded and often church-run Indian boarding schools across the country in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indian children were forcibly abducted by government agents and sent to schools hundreds of miles away, often beaten and starved or otherwise abused, especially when they spoke their native languages. The National Native American Boarding Schools Healing Coalition was formed following a national symposium in 2011, when leaders from the US and Canada came together to discuss the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the need for such a process here in the US. So Dr. Samuel Torres is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the coalition, and he continues to lead really thoughtful and strategic work here in the United States. Sam, you've been part of developing this national strategy to increase public awareness and cultivate healing for the profound trauma experienced by individuals, families, and communities resulting from the U.S. adoption and implementation of the boarding school policy of 1869. What can you tell us about this process, and specifically how has or how could the Catholic Church in the U.S. support these efforts? Thanks.
Thank you, Gillian, for the question, and really honored to be here with the other panelists today and with everyone joining. I'll go ahead and just introduce myself in my language of Nahuatl real quick. So, Piali Iwan Donalte, Noyolik Niwan, Na Notoka Samuel, Ni Meshika Iwan Ni Nahuatl. So what I just said in Nahuatl was hello and warm greetings to everyone. As my relative, my name is Sam Torres. I am Mexica and Nahua. Born and raised in Los Angeles. Most of my family is from Zacatecas, Mexico, and I currently reside in Minnesota, Dakota Makoche. So I really appreciate the question, and I think one thing that I'd like to offer is kind of somewhat of a question, food for thought, a counter question. And knowing that we have so much work to do here on the lands we now know as the United States, seeing some of the work that has been charted in the lands now known as Canada, a question that I would pose is, what is, with respect to these commissions and reconciliation ideas, what is reconciliation if truth and accountability efforts do not grasp the root of past injustices, as well as their contemporary impacts? And really, shouldn't reconciliation not only address the failure to honor those treaties, but also return land to Indigenous people? So some very central questions, I believe. And we have to start deep, I feel, and particularly in the United States, there has been this kind of culture of historical amnesia that has provoked a widespread misunderstanding and neglect of the truth of this history, the truth of boarding schools, really the truth of the first compulsory education model of the United States and of Canada as well. And so much of that is connected to how Native youth and youth in general on these lands collectively are continue to be impacted by those methods and by those approaches that were experimented in the boarding school era, and particularly as a federal policy, and how the Catholic Church, as early as the early 1800s in the 1819 with the Indian Civilization Fund Act, offered these government contracts to Christian missions to forcibly remove children and to reprogram them, often resulting in physical, emotional, mental, psychological, and sexual abuse, and this happening for generations. But we have to look back to sort of this dualism of settler colonialism and Christian dominion, right? Both structurally and epistemologically, have both greatly fractured a premise of reconciliation, given a massive social, economic, and political power asymmetry between Indigenous nations, settler states, and now, of course, religious leadership. Reconciliation can really only take place, in my view, when the impacts of both structural and epistemological colonialism are restored and transformed. And I think it's helpful to remember that just as healing cannot take place without justice, reconciliation is truly unattainable without transforming root causes and sources of domination, and in some cases, when necessary, dismantling systems of oppression, even if they occur from religious communities. So a little bit of this has been said, but the experiences of past commissions continue to inform us that reconciliation cannot be the first aim of resolving historical trauma and addressing these traumas toward Indigenous people. But I think it can be a reflexive framework to work toward. These commissions remind us, I believe, of a central issue and guiding ethos that these processes are all faced with, that reconciliation often finds itself subsumed under efforts of charity and saviorism, which ultimately can serve to evasively maneuver from guilt and disarm its impact. I believe that two scholars that have been really helpful in illuminating a strong understanding of what this looks like are Wayne Yang and Eve Tuck. Eve Tuck is a Alaska Native scholar. She's Anunga, and they talk about this, caution about this notion called settler moves to innocence. And they describe this as those strategies or positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility without giving up land or power or privilege, really without having much to change at all. And I think that that's an important reminder, because though in our pursuit of trying to understand and restore this truth and history, while certainly an important first approach, that critical consciousness that comes with this responsibility of learning what those impacts were, what those impacts continue to be, that critical consciousness of racism, of dehumanization, of physical, sexual, spiritual abuse, all characteristic of boarding school experiences, including genocide and settler colonialism. These are imperative to contextualize impacts of settler colonialism and boarding schools to Native peoples. But if we stop there, what emerges in the pursuit of this critical consciousness, think about the think pieces and the statements and all that stuff, can create distractions, can create diversions and delay that, and those delays that relieve settler feelings of guilt or responsibility and obscure the need to give up land, power, privilege, resources, these components that have been called upon by Indigenous peoples to governments and religious communities and religious leadership for generations. We don't need think tanks for generations to determine what those need to be. Those have been identified. Many historical boarding schools are still within the ownership of the Catholic Church, and those lands often are not occupied, but can very easily be returned to nearby tribal nations. These are questions that need to be undertaken with far more urgency. Contemporary examples of settler moves to innocence also include the trendy emergence of land acknowledgements, official apologies, I think we kind of discussed a little bit today, that neglect meaningful commitments to action and restoring disrupted lifeways. So we must move into, of course, this place of critical consciousness, but not stay there. I think that is a trap that obscures the need to meaningfully address historical traumas. So the nature of this struggle then unequivocally reveals the necessity for a fundamental deviation from Western approaches that have been historically and to this day continue to limit the voices of Indigenous people, Indigenous knowledges, and Indigenous ways of being. Letting Native people lead, hearing what they have to say, supporting their struggle, and acting when they say what they are calling for, even if land, power, or privilege is in consideration. These are essential places to start. Spaces that are prepared in this way walk a path toward reconciliation, I believe, though they do not seek reconciliation. They seek restoration. Reconciliation may be possible but I think it's dependent on how we tend to these crucial moments of history that require attention to truth, justice, and then the opening possibilities of healing. Consistent demands for, I'll give you a couple of examples here, but consistent demands of some of these ideas continue to be made by generations of folks that have been affected by boarding schools. In no particular order, but I think it's important to start with is the access to boarding school documents. Church, government, private archives, collections are so essential, and we have seen the healing possibility of these documents, and they rightfully belong to Indigenous people, Native people. Of course, there are governance and stewardship issues that all need to be tended to, but boarding school documents are essential. The examination and location of children in marked or unmarked graves at boarding school facilities, Native-led and culturally appropriate opportunities for survivors to offer their experiences and testimony, educational, religious, and political apparatuses that recognize and educate citizens of the history and impact of boarding schools, the right and resources for Indigenous people to direct their own healing, utilizing the type of healing methods that they choose, traditional or contemporary, accountability of those who committed crimes or covered up crimes, and the restoration and return of language, culture, lifeways, and land. Now, these are not an exhaustive bullet-pointed list, but they represent a general overview that require time and resources. A Truth and Healing Commission in the United States holds the possibility of generating some of those substantive approaches and recommendations. This can be initiated with current legislative efforts that NABS is supporting. Senate Bill 1723 was recently passed out of committee in the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. We hope that everyone on this call can support that, can support a multi-year process that brings boarding school survivors' voices to the center so that recommendations can be produced. Because at that point, we will have a blueprint brought forth by Native people. We need individuals and religious communities to support this. We are eager to see this introduced in the House of Representatives, and we're confident that it will pass. Hopefully this legislative session, if not, in legislative sessions to come. But this is not the only thing that's going to address completely. A 5-year investigation, a 7-year investigation, 20-year investigation is not going to on its own heal the trauma towards Native peoples from boarding schools, but it's a start and will lay out a map. So it's efforts like this and other efforts to make sure that boarding school voices are not undermined. As recently as 2010, the statute of limitations in South Dakota was changed so that boarding school survivors could not produce litigation against the Catholic Church. It was the attorneys of the Catholic Church that actually changed the statute of limitations that prevented the testimony of these boarding school survivors and survivors of sexual violence. So we need to make sure that we are supporting those efforts. It's not just one commission, it's a full commitment. And so we invite everyone. And so I'll stop there. I really appreciate the opportunity to share about the work that our Healing Coalition is doing and the movement for truth, justice, and healing on Indian boarding schools in the United States.
Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate how specific you are about, I mean, you just named a few, but those are some giant steps that everybody can take if they're serious beyond land acknowledgements, etc. And I really thank you for the challenge. We'll and you set up Stephanie really well. So no pressure, Stephanie. But so for background here, in June of 2021, Secretary Deb Haaland of the Department of the Interior announced an investigation into the history of the federal government's administration and funding of Indian boarding schools. And we now know that the government ran roughly half of these schools and administered and funded about 1/4 of the schools in partnership with the Catholic Church and another quarter in partnership with Protestant churches. And even though this conversation is focused on the Catholic Church, our intention is not to let any other faith communities off the hook. So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Stephanie Jacoby to reflect on the Catholic Church's response to the investigation. And as background, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Subcommittee on Native American Affairs, they have a pastoral plan on ministry to Native and Indigenous peoples, which is not public, as I understand. We haven't seen the plan. It includes a focus on boarding school accountability. And Stephanie has been involved in the effort to identify all Catholic-operated boarding schools designated specifically to educate Native American and Alaska Native children in the United States, and second, to identify all Catholic entities that were involved in the operation of each school. So your list, released in May, of Catholic-operated boarding schools in the United States pre-1978 represents the first and most comprehensive source for information on Native boarding schools that were overseen or staffed by the Catholic Church before 1978. So what are we learning through this process, and how has or how can such efforts contribute to what Sam has requested and challenged us to provide? Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Jillian. Yes, I'm Dr. Stephanie Jacoby. I'm the Director of Archives in the Archdiocese of Washington. And I want to thank you for inviting me. Thank you for focusing on our work. And it is an honor to be here with the other panelists. Yeah, our work specifically is a work in progress. We did focus on Catholic-operated boarding schools with an educational purpose. We did not include orphanages. We did not include hybrid schools. Actually, the first question that we got about the list after we released it was from a survivor of a hybrid school, which were schools that took in a handful of boarders, but were primarily day schools, which were not included. But our work was mainly in the effort, as Sam was saying, for truth. Was to get the Catholic Church basically to understand its debt to this issue and how pervasive it was. There was several lists that were kind of running around that were prepared by various entities, but none of them had been checked comprehensively against a wide range of Catholic sources, and that's what we were attempting to do. I worked with a group of 5 other archivists and Catholic lay people, archivists for dioceses, archivists for religious orders. As the people who basically hold the records of the Catholic Church, we used our knowledge to kind of combine this list to see where records would be and kind of use it as a list for survivors, for families, for tribal nations, to be able to figure out where records would actually be. That's kind of the first step, find where the stuff is. And that was really our purpose, was to look at the entire history of these schools, because many of them, the people who were in charge of them switched on a regular basis. So they would be one religious order 10 years, one diocese for 10 years, one other thing for 10 years. And so our purpose was really to provide a list of, if you were at this school or if a family member was at this school for this period of time, here's where you should look for those specific records, because as I said, it changed over the course of time. So that was really the first thing that we were attempting to do. And we were a grassroots effort. We are not an organized effort connected to the USCCB at all. We were a grassroots effort of, as I said, Catholic archivists who came together as a group to do this. So we kind of did this of our own volition. Our dioceses, our religious orders, our employers allowed us the time within our workday to contribute to this effort. We spent over 2 years going through this and dealing with the list. We have the list, as we know, is a work in progress. There is actually another effort that we worked on during the period of time we were working on the list. We basically worked with the Archivists of Women Religious, which is a fraternal organization for archivists that specifically deal with women religious organizations. They got a grant through the National Historical Publications and Records Commission to actually scan all Catholic directories and put them up on the Internet Archive. And then they're going to use that information to go through and refine the list even further, and particularly take it back before the American Civil War. We concentrated from the late 19th century up to 1978. That's primarily the date range that we were looking at. But that effort is going to extend the list back. We don't know if we'll be able to get it back to 1819, as that was really the beginning of the boarding school effort in the United States. But we're going to try to get it back as far as we can. And all of that was done as part of this grant project. Jillian also mentioned the USCCB pastoral plan. That is a multi-year process to put that plan out. Father Michael Carson, who is staff at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, has been shepherding that effort through now for, I think, about 5 years. And the plan is actually going to be voted on next week at the USCCB meeting in Baltimore. And once it's voted on and approved by the bishops of the United States, then it will be made public. And Father Mike is pretty confident it's going to get passed, so he's already planning his implementation for that. Which is very important. That will bring the USCCB forward in how it has a plan to work with Native communities across the United States. But I think it's important to point out, I think there are many efforts that have been going through for dioceses and religious orders to kind of work with Native communities. And these have all been done on an individual level as opposed to a national level. Or something that's kind of a national effort or a commission like Sam was talking to us about. There have been many efforts, particularly amongst the women religious, to look at their records, to put them out, to work with Native communities. But as I said, this is all done individually. We have not had an organized effort as of yet. In November of 2021, Archbishop Paul Coakley of Oklahoma City and Bishop James Wall of Gallup, New Mexico did actually put out a letter to the bishops of the United States. This was in advance of the Department of the Interior report, where they encouraged all of the dioceses to look back at their own records, see what information they had, to reach out to Native nations and begin to discern how healing and reconciliation can begin. And so we did actually have that level of leadership, and our grassroots group did actually form kind of in response to that letter. So people started contacting each other, and we got together and started working on this because of that. So I think I'll stop there because I think I've kind of done what we've been going forward. As I said, it's been individual efforts, individual dioceses, such as the ones specifically in Minnesota. There's been some work with the Red Cloud Indian School, and also between the White Earth community and the Sisters of St. Benedict. Those are 3 projects I know that are going forward and are getting good results. But there are these individual efforts, but they are small efforts between individual Native communities, individual survivor groups, and individual religious orders and dioceses. And that's the state we really are in right now, is that there is no national effort. It is that more individual level effort.
Yeah. That's sobering, right? I mean, I think in some ways we wait for movement to come from the top to inspire us, and yet that's actually very rarely the way change happens, right? It's
I think our goal at our group was really to inspire as many as we could. I mean, that was something that we were hoping with the list, is that once religious orders and dioceses across the country really were kind of forced through the acknowledgement of this list, because we contacted each of them individually before we actually released the list to the public. So we asked them to look at our list, asked them to tell us if something was wrong, if they were going to scream at us, if they were going to congratulate us. Honestly, most of people were very happy that we were presenting them with this, because it kind of spurred them to look back at their own records. And we were hoping it would be a catalyst to get people to begin to look at this issue, begin to look at what they needed to do with this issue. And so we just need to, in my mind, we need to continue that effort.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to open some conversation between the panelists if you have questions for one another. And I would also just encourage those who are listening in, if you want to ask a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to it. Do any of you have questions or comments for one another?
Well, I guess I have one thing to call out. I think that Peter said that I think can probably be a lesson to everyone working on this issue. You were speaking specifically about the Jesuits, but I quickly wrote it down as you were talking, which is we are most ourselves when we are in right relations with Indigenous people. And I think that that's something that all of us that work on this issue need to keep in mind, is to become more ourselves. We need to strive for those right relations.
it takes a long time, and then there's ups and downs and spiraling back, and yeah, there's lots of iterations to the process.
Lots of iterations, but since we're at the beginning, I think that's a goal to look at for us in the United States, since we're so at the beginning of this, that we need to look at that through this idea of becoming more ourselves, and to look at those right relations and what that actually means to us as well as to Native nations.
I'll just add a little bit to that, because I appreciated that note as well, and also just add there, appreciate your comment on that, Stephanie. I think that while it very much feels like that for a lot of folks, particularly non-Native folks, these are issues in Indian country that have been we have been confronting with for generations. And so the urgency is that there are boarding school survivors that are still with us. And that while there is a long way to go, and we know that boarding schools was the boarding school policy era, as well as the impacts of that and the complicit actors, such as many Christian denominations, at least 13 of them that we have identified, the Catholic Church being one of them. We're looking at over 150 years, even 200 years, even longer if we look at praying town villages on the northeastern seaboard as early as the 1600s. Generations, hundreds of years, really, of assimilation-oriented practices to strip Native people of their languages and their cultures and their traditions. It's going to require us significant work and generations of time and resources and effort to restore that which has been disrupted. What I think that I want to make that connection to, what Peter mentioned earlier about, not confronting only delays, and the goal of restoring right relations is something that, of course, we ought to be centrally fixated with. And I'll say that if we look at processes like a Truth Commission, right, and that bring boarding school documents to the center, that have what we believe is necessary components of subpoena power for documents to be produced, and we feel that to be important, not necessarily to be, confronting entities and institutions that would be not in favor of supporting, but that they're perhaps feeling that they're not in the place of sharing those archival documents. It provides a little bit of encouragement, you could say, to bring those documents to the center. If we can do that before those processes are even formed, I think that we change what that effort looks like. If Catholic communities and leadership produce these documents before they're subpoenaed, that is a huge difference, because we believe that this process will eventually happen, but it would be in everyone's best interest towards that collective vision, that goal of right relations, of restoring right relations, of doing it willingly, of doing it being forthcoming with these documents, because we have that opportunity, we have that power, that authority, that possibility right now. Much better to do it before a subpoena from Congress, comes in the mail.
Oh yeah, and much better to do it before lawyers get involved, 100%. And I certainly agree with that. And what I would say is that there are projects that have existed that have done that, but we need to multiply them. We need many, many more. We need them to not be in ones and twos, but in scores and dozens. And we hope, and we're trying to work towards getting more people involved in that, to work with Native communities to produce those documents. Because as I said, it's not that no one has done it, it's just that the numbers right now are very small. And I think that we do need to work towards that, and to have that initiative to do that ourselves, our initiative to do that without someone forcing us through a commission. That's really what I think we need to work towards. Now, I'm not saying the commission is a bad thing, or that we shouldn't support the role of the commission, but we ourselves within the church need to do that.
I think I really agree with Sam and Stephanie on this. Producing documents willingly creates at least some degree of open channels of communication. But when you're forced to do something, then you spend half your energy defending yourself and looking inwards.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that there won't be problems. It doesn't mean that there won't be pain, but at least there are open channels of communication. And in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not have subpoena power, and it certainly had, and its descendants continue to have difficulties getting access to documentation. But I would say the TRC became a moral and spiritual reference point for the country, and that their attitude and their recommendations have kind of set a bar, a moral bar to be achieved. So they've made, I think, a huge contribution. And yes, yeah, they have great spiritual respect, I would say, and they became, in their own right, spiritual leaders through the act of hearing and listening to the stories, year after year, month after month.
So I want to open for Jim or Sam to feel free to pose some questions or comments to the other panelists. And then there are a lot of questions for you all in the chat. So we can look at those and see if you want to take any on. Or I can pose one for you so you don't have to read.
Well, I'd like to defer to Jim LaBelle, who is the board president of NABS. We've been so fortunate to be in community on this issue. Jim, it's always such a pleasure to be in your presence. And we were just speaking before the call started about the House Natural Resource Committee hearing on the Truth and Healing Commission bill, specifically in the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples. And Jim had the opportunity to share his experiences first, for the first time in a very historic way. Certainly, it's not something that I think it's not something to celebrate as the first time that boarding school survivors were, ever heard in the halls of Congress on Capitol Hill, but it's certainly historic in a way where we are seeing movement there. But Jim, I want to defer to you because I know I just really appreciate always reflecting and learning from you.
Well, thank you, Sam. I think there's a part of me that believes that the settler colonial religious orders were initially having their hearts in the right place in terms of the thoughts that they had about Christianizing and missionizing. But I think where the disconnect happened had to do with bringing that all to us with your European cultural worldviews, and there was either a blindness to our spirituality as Indigenous people, and there was a period of time, I believe, that there could have been an immense understanding that I just have to go back to what Reverend Peter Bisson said, that there's a lot of shared commonality in terms of a great creator, and but after that, I think the European aspect of doing this were imposed on us without having a better understanding of who we are, and I think that kind of created a lot of the problems that we have today, and I want you to know that we have something to remind you of what's called intergenerational trauma. My mother went to a BIA day school in Kotzebue in the 1920s, and she herself was punished severely for speaking Inupiaq in her village. And she often shared that with me through the years. And I just want you to know that it's a lot of our families have these. Some of them, I believe, really. If you think about the Stockholm syndrome, for example, the earliest contacts were based on this fear of hell and damnation, and that created an attachment, I think, that was maybe unintended, but it was handed down to their children and grandchildren, and the aspect of that is still with us today, even generations later. I'll give you some examples that in Alaska, even though Alaska Natives make up maybe 20% of the state's population, we are over 40% in the criminal justice system. If you can imagine being over twice in our criminal justice system. I'll take it even further. If you go to our foster care program in Alaska, over 60% of all the children in the state's foster care system are Alaska Native children. We have the highest domestic violence rates in the country. We have some of the highest suicide rates, 3 or 4 times the national average. And to me, these are symptoms of things that happened generations ago, if not hundreds of years ago, that are still with us and unresolved today. That's kind of where I'm coming from. I know I don't know if this is on the right track with our discussion here, but I wanted to just kind of give you some information about what we're still dealing with up here. I have a lot of friends that I went to boarding school with who died from suicide themselves. I have a lot of friends who became street people and are homeless today. I have a lot of friends who committed serious crimes and are incarcerated today. And these are all boarding school survivors, or if not, their descendants. And the unintended consequences of all of that is that thousands of people, Native people, are taken away from being supportive of their families in their hunting, fishing, and gathering. They're removed from their community and not being able to help their families. And the families become dependent on the state and federal welfare programs. And so I guess what I'm trying to illustrate is there's all these little hidden consequences of these early contacts, and the churches of all denominations participated in that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, we don't really cover this in our history books. And then when we do, we talk about it as if it's history rather than something that's continuing to live and reverberate today in our bodies, in our communities and institutions. So thank you for bringing that into the present, because that's makes it even more urgent.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't go away. As they say, I was in one group focusing on, adversity in early childhood. And they say what happens in childhood, it's not like Las Vegas. What happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood, right? It continues. I also just wanted to say that I really appreciate the oft reference to settlers. I mean, we often refer to Native Americans or African Americans, and I feel like I should start referring to myself as a settler American. So thank you for that language. I think that's useful. And I'm going to bring up some questions from the chat. Speaking of settler language, there was a question from Cynthia Mendoza. Could you please recommend a website or a link to Settler Moves to Innocence? I have so much to learn and unlearn as a settler. If anybody has something like that, feel free to put it in the chat. And we'll add these to our resource list as well that's available on our website.
I'll just, if I can, I'll just go ahead and respond directly to that. It's a beautiful article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And similar to what I was referencing earlier, it really does center some firm, strong language around what it means to be in true allyship, even if it makes us uncomfortable, even if it means giving up land, power, and privilege. So again, it's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. Often we hear things like, oh, let's decolonize our minds, decolonize our spice cabinet, decolonize the classroom, things like this. These have become trendy changes that folks feel good about when they're trying to really sometimes say diversify or indigenize or strip down something. But decolonization is centrally concerned with the return and restoration of land, power, and privilege. And it's an open access article. You can find it on scholar.google.com. It's open access. If you just type in Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, there's about 50 sites in different universities that have them hosted. But I'll be happy to follow up and choose one.
Thank you, Sam. And that leads to a question from Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzar, who is actually a colleague at Georgetown who focuses on Indigenous studies in Siberia. It's amazing how global this topic can become if we want to really get into it. She says, on land back issues, this is a question she directed to Sam. On land back issues, can you be specific about some cases for returns of boarding school lands near Indigenous communities? Are there any models for this, or is the process still too early to point to successes?
There are a couple, but certainly not enough. And I wouldn't say it's too early. It's probably just too stubborn at this point, which is, I think an important clarification. But we are in communication with some folks leading efforts in Rapid City, South Dakota. The Rapid City Indian Boarding School had acres and acres, over 100 acres of land. Of course, it was an industrial school, and students were working the land. They were forced to labor and produce goods, agriculture, a lot of land that is now in a rather desirable part of South Dakota, Rapid City. And some of that land is now being used residentially. Because there was an understanding, rather a misunderstanding, that after the Rapid City Indian Boarding School closed, that it would just be handed back over to the municipality, Rapid City. There are some efforts that are being looked at with respect to a return clause of how those lands were even appropriated in the first place, because when they were taken, they were Indian lands before, and they still are, but they're being occupied, you could say. And their legal processes are looking at utilizing the return clause, that because those lands are no longer being used for education, for the education of Native youth, that they are to be returned back to the tribe. Now, because there are several tribes in South Dakota and Rapid City is an occupied land, they are working out a creative way to be able to have a land or several land parcels be allocated for the use of the to be dedicated for Native youth, led by Native people, to have community centers there, to have language and cultural revitalization occur in these places. One of the critical difficulties is that much of that land is now being occupied by residential housing that's now been there for several decades. So there are certainly creative ways that they're going to have to be able to address this. But that is one example of how boarding school lands are being returned back to the people. I think there are more instances that are likely going to pop up where abandoned boarding school lands that are owned by Christian churches, several denominations, we are sure, where those lands can be transferred back to nearby tribes by really just rewriting that deed. So we need to see more of them. There are creative ways of having those kinds of things happen, but I think we need to be far more courageous than we are right now about making sure that those lands be returned.
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little Alaskan context to what Samuel was talking about. I want to bring your attention to two things. One is called the Comity Plan for Alaska, COMITY. This is where the Right Reverend Sheldon Jackson, I believe, went to New York City at the turn of the last century, if not a little sooner, and gathered all of the churches there, specifically to assign the different denominations to different parts of Alaska. And I hope that you spend some time getting familiar with that, the Comity Plan. You can Google it, you can download some of the information, and that kind of gives you a little different take on what happened in Alaska. The other thing I want to bring your attention to with regards to land, after these various churches became settled in Alaska as a result of the Comity Plan, it didn't take very long for them to begin advocating for land. And I'd like to bring your attention to something called the Missions Act of 1900. The Missions Act of 1900. And this was one of the first pieces of legislation directed at Alaska, besides the Organic Act of 1884, that put lands into the hands of these various denominations. And to my knowledge, they've morphed and changed and got sold and leased, and in fact, we have some church groups today that still have ownership of some of these lands based on that early piece of legislation. So I just wanted to put it out there for you.
Thank you. Thank you for teaching us about our history. It's just incredible how much we don't know, even when we're educated people at fancy universities.
I actually wouldn't mind sharing a little story about how there was a mix-up between the Catholics and one of the other denominations about who belonged to what church, and there was a big battle between those two. And after a final agreement, one set of villages were given a nice little letter or certificate. Thank you for being a good Jesuit, being a good Catholic. You're now going to be a good other church member. And the other church did the same to their set of villages. So even then they were fighting over control of some of our communities.
Thank you. I want to move to Sam and then to Mary Beth. Sam, there was a question for you from Hannah Titus. What would it look like for the Catholic Church to facilitate native healing practices? What resources are needed to facilitate access to biomedical and traditional healing for these multi-generational epigenetic traumas?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on that question. I think that we first have to look at sort of this dialectic between intent versus impact. I think centrally, the one question that comes up a lot is, now that we know what's happening, or in folks that have initiated that journey towards critical consciousness, there's this desire to want to support and act and to do this work, and sometimes moving too quickly towards healing, I think fundamentally is a really, really big obstacle that we see. And I think this is a very important opportunity to pause and try to understand and recognize what the role of religious communities and individuals and leadership is in this very important area. And I will say that while certainly this doesn't represent and essentialize everyone's feelings around this, but a broad scope of folks, tribal nations included, boarding school survivors and descendants, have told us that it is not the right of religious communities, leadership, churches to direct healing and to even have those venues and facilitations to say, hey, we're going to heal you now. We're the ones that traumatize you, but we're the ones that are going to heal you right now. And I think there is a cognitive dissonance there that has to be named. Now, I say that kind of bluntly, but I think it's important to recognize that there are ways that these efforts can be supported. We have to remember that boarding schools and the complicit actors of the federal government and the Catholic Church and many other Christian denominations, there was violent disruptions that caused the need for cultural revitalization, the need for language revitalization, the need to heal from intergenerational trauma, and shown by these epigenetic markers and research that we now see today. I think there are efforts that can be undertaken to support native-led processes here, but we are concerned about those efforts that are led by religious communities. Can we imagine somebody who's experienced abuse, physical, psychological, sexual, spiritual abuse, in a facility where the crucifix is there, and then being invited to share their testimony in a place where there are also crucifixes? Talk about emotional responses and triggers that come up all over the place. These perhaps are unintentional by well-intentioned religious communities and leaders, but I think that it is an important place to be deeply reflective, to make sure that we're not just looking for one or two or a small group of Native voices that say, hey, it's okay to have this in a church, to lead in the ways that we know how. There are, as Stephanie mentioned, largely scattered efforts to address this. There's not one universal comprehensive method that the United States dioceses and archdioceses are working towards this, to addressing boarding school trauma. But we are concerned about those projects that are gaining, starting to gain some momentum, that are inviting boarding school survivors into their own facilities with their own oral historians, with their own resources, equipment, leaders, and documenting from their perspective. We have to keep in mind that there is a role, a responsibility, and a place. And if we want to contribute, if religious communities are seeking to contribute in those ways, there are ways of doing that. But I think it's strongly needed to support Native-led efforts, particularly as it pertains to healing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. And then we're going to move to Mary Beth. Sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
I'd just like to add something that maybe to support what Sam was saying as well, is this, I think I agree that you don't begin leading the healing, but you need to begin understanding what the harm was, so that you would be able to support our healing. And I'd like to direct your attention to Dr. Folletti, who was the main discoverer of, if you will, of how trauma affected people later in life with their health disparities. And some of you already know this. It's called the ACEs study. It stands for Acute Childhood Experiences, Adverse, Childhood Experiences. So I'm a kind of a walking example of that. I have so many different autoimmune diseases now that I think arose out of my own personal trauma in the boarding schools that I had gone to. The other thing I want to bring your attention to, and I think Dr. Bisson probably knows this more than many, Dr. Gabor Mate has spent his lifetime in Canada interacting with Indigenous people there, and has found a very strong correlation between trauma and addiction. And many of our people in Alaska are not immune to what Dr. Gabor Mate found in Canada with the Indian or Indigenous population there. So I guess it's just to further give you some fruit for thought and to read up on that. I think there's no question that the healing that we will have will come from ourselves within our own communities. It's just been dormant in many ways, and we need to foster it and have it become out in the open again.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for the reminder of the ACEs. It's come up in so much of the work we've been talking about. Mary Beth, well, let me first introduce Mary Beth. So this forum, a multi-part series, is sponsored by Catholic Relief Services. And they've been sort of leading on some of the global work on deinstitutionalization, moving away from orphanage-based care, which is a symptom of some of the same dynamics that we're talking about here, toward family and community-based care. And so, Mary Beth, first of all, thank you for your partnership in all of this work. But I wanted to ask you to tie some of what we're talking about today with, borders that extend beyond Turtle Island, North America. Can you? Yes.
Sure, I'm happy to, Gillian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian, and thank you to all our panelists today for the wisdom and perspectives that you brought today to our conversation, and to all our participants who are joining live or listening to the recordings. So, although we've focused our conversation today on boarding schools in North America, the history of church-involved Indigenous child-family separation is really global in scope. Boarding schools were frequently administered in cooperation with Christian missions with the express purpose of Christianizing Indigenous peoples in Latin America, North America, as we've heard today, the Arctic and the Pacific. But the history not only includes boarding schools, but also forced adoptions of Indigenous children to non-Indigenous parents. And why common themes exist in these histories of separation and in church-Indigenous relations today, it's imperative to recognize that the policies, impacts, and needs are unique for each community and nation state. So only when we acknowledge the unique truths of each situation, can healing begin, as we've heard today. With this in mind, I just want to briefly share a couple of examples around the world beyond North America, and then conclude with just a few remarks on the Catholic Church today in confronting this history of colonization linked with evangelization. So the first example I wanted to lift up was Latin America. We've seen that Christian missions has similar histories as the United States and Canada, with using boarding schools as a part of a quote, quote, civilization process, although it's been much less uniform than in the United States and Canada. And so we've seen, we talked about contracts that were offered to religious orders by governments. We heard that happen in the US and Canada, and that's happened in Latin America too. And that governments would fund Catholic religious orders to educate indigenous peoples. In Colombia, until the 1970s, governments did 9 Catholic orders to set up missions where they separated children from their families from the age of 5. And in Venezuela, governments gave 1 religious order the political and civil and educational authority over territories within these contracts. And so from the 1920s to the 1970s, they've set up boarding schools for the Waro peoples, imposing these Western values and Spanish language on these children. And so we see this history happening in southeastern Peruvian Amazon, in Paraguay, in Brazil, in Chile, and etc. Although the Catholic religious orders still run boarding schools in Latin America today, they no longer involve forcible removals of children from their families. And we're seeing improved relationships between indigenous communities and the Catholic Church in Latin America, examples of these. And in fact, the Catholic Church has played a very different role in Guatemala. Rather than supporting government systems of indigenous child-family separation, we've seen the Church in the Archdiocese of Guatemala City lead courageous efforts in the early 2000s to identify and reconnect kidnapped and missing indigenous Mayan children who were kidnapped during the Civil War with their biological families. We're short on time. I was hoping to really lift up and bring into this conversation the movement that's happened in Australia and New Zealand, especially with forced adoptions that happened of Indigenous children to white families. And the work that the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Australia has done in some of the things that we've been talking about today, about starting to recognize and own take ownership of the history and the involvement of the church through their, even 25 years ago in their statement on that, and how they have calling us forth to how there is a commitment to continue by the church, to continue the healing process, to continue to claim that truth and to support the needs to move forward together and in a meaningful way. And I will share probably through the resources that are available on the resource page, but through the global church, we have seen the global church take different ownership that's increased and started off very context specific of a recognition of past injustices. And we heard about Pope Francis and his claiming, taking that apology and actually owning it by the part of the church rather than just people who are the church. And so now as we move forward into the future, really looking at how we can move from this history of mission and evangelization that's one directional, that's linked with colonialism, but rather entering into an approach of integral human development and towards this process that's in the church right now of the synodal church of communion, participation, and mission, and really seeing how that we can be a church that exists, be in connection with people, and that really does the dialogue and listening, and that is really present in new ways. And so I will turn it back over to Gillian to close us out. I think maybe Sam might be offering us a few words. So thank you very much for being here today. Gillian?
Thank you, Mary Beth. Yeah, and we're going to be talking about some of the ways the church is moving with this history in mind in a future webinar, so stay tuned. But yes, we're short on time, but Sam, you've been so kind to offer a few words to close, mindful of the fact that one of the things boarding schools took away was language and expression and spirituality and culture. So to revive, to honor it, to lift it up, we'll ask you to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Mary Beth. Peter, everyone that's joined today, Stephanie, of course, your voice has been so important. And Jim, thank you for offering everything that you've offered today, that you continue to offer us the leadership, that you continue to offer us at the Healing Coalition, but also in this national and international movement, as Mary Beth stated. Boarding schools has been seen as a model for so many different international settler colonial struggles. And in each of those, there has been resistance and there has been active resurgence. And I want to say that though so often, and it is important to be able to center the inflicted harms and the traumas, but I think it's also important to state that our people have always been resilient. We're going to continue to be resilient and have resisted colonial trauma and the trauma inflicted through boarding schools and assimilation-oriented approaches in other institutional forms. You know, we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the institutional violence that the medical system or orphanages, the child welfare system, and many other forms of colonial violence that has targeted our children. But I would like to offer us that, you know, an opportunity to reflect and to be in a space of sustained momentum. This is not a space where we hope to sow despair. This is a space that we hope to create a spark. Perhaps those of you that are joining us today, this may be the first time that you've heard about some of the impacts, historical and contemporaneously, of boarding schools, and many of you have done a lot of work and are doing this work actively. So I want to offer this song as a means of continuing this momentum and sustaining ourselves. It's a song that reminds, in my traditions, of why we live the way that we do. The closest approximation and word that we had for creator was Ipal Nemowa, Ipal Nemowani, which the Spanish translated as that for which we live. And really, it is a central guiding essence that reminds us of who we are as Indigenous people. And it's a place of strength. It's a place of being. It's a deliberate way of living in our traditions. And so I want to leave us with this song. It's a song of celebration for who we are as Indigenous people. So you may not know the translation, but please know that it comes from every cell in my being, and that it is in this work that we do, food and sustenance for this work. And so for those of you that are also doing this work in a good way, I hope that it also offers some sustenance to be able to learn from what you heard today and to do this work towards restoring right relations with Native peoples everywhere. Sanye Juan Ipal Nemo Alinen Lamatia Akaso Aiko Huaya Akaso Nona Huya Intena Huacan Ogua Oguaya Ogua Oguaya Oh guaya, oh guaya, oh guaya, oh guaya. Santit latso, set selo ano vai.
Imonel Quildonol Inipane Moa Non iskisho chikatawa sho shiksano kol Elequia sanine otlamatia owa owaya owa owaya 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 owaya.
That's Okabati Miak.
Thank you, Sam.